The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Eric Lufer, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar we offer today to review our paper on data centers in Michigan. We subtitled that An Evaluation of the Controversies Surrounding Hyperscale Data Center Development. This webinar is being presented and the paper was authored by the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. We are a nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is our 110th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to the promotion of sound public policy for state and local government through accurate, independent, and objective research. I think you'll find the paper we're going to review lives up to those. We're a private, not-for-profit organization, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters to help us continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. If you value how this webinar and the associated paper contribute to the public discourse and hope to keep the Citizens Research Council as an objective, independent, and credible source of information into the next century, please consider a contribution. I also encourage everyone to join our email list. You can find on our website. If you haven't found that, it's crcmich.org. That's a way to stay plugged into the research we're doing on a paper we'll release later this week on the new state budget, providing some analysis, looking at issues of taxation, childcare, school finance, issues in Detroit, a whole wide range of things that affect Michigan. And that email lets you know when new material is available and invites you to come to our website and learn about it. We have everyone on mute during the webinar, so we won't be able to hear you. We're not going to have hands raised, but we invite you to use the chat session or the questions to submit your questions, and we'll review those. We try to leave time at the end of the webinar to review those questions, and anything we don't get to during the session, we'll try to provide an email response after the fact. If you have any issues, technical problems, please let us know by calling 734-542-8001. So real quick, our presenter today and the primary author of our data center paper is Eric Dennis. He joined the Research Council in 2022 as an expert in civil infrastructure policy. Previous to his position with us, he spent 10 years as a transportation system analyst focusing on policy implications of emerging technologies such as autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, intelligent transportation systems. He's been a Michigan licensed professional engineer since 2012. As a practicing engineer, he has design and project experience across multiple domains, including highways, airfields, telecommunication, and watershed management. He received his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from MSU and holds master's degree in environmental engineering, urban and regional planning, both from the University of Michigan. With that, let me turn it over to Eric, and we look forward to hearing from you. And again, if you have any questions, you can use the question function in the software, and we'll get to those at the end. Eric, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lufer. So first I want to address some context. Why has data center development become such a contentious issue in the past year or two? Data centers are not new, but the scale of recent and anticipated investment is unprecedented, as is the scale of the individual projects. Now, some of this investment is just to support the expanding digital economy, email, e-commerce, streaming, this webinar, nearly everything we do on our computers or digital devices is supported by cloud services. If you didn't realize this, there is no literal cloud, that's data centers. But moreover, the tech companies are now investing heavily in next generation AI tools based on large language models. Both the training and operation of LLMs requires huge amounts of computational capacity and thus huge amounts of power. And the tech companies are now in competition with each other to develop the best, most capable LLMs to corner various enterprise markets. And so are in something of a race to get these hyperscale data centers up and running as soon as possible. So all the money being thrown around has a lot of people excited. This is viewed as a generational opportunity for economic growth by many economic development professionals, public officials, more generally aficionados of ceremonial groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings. And this often comes with outsized expectations and overlooking some risks. On the other side, opposition to data centers has become something of a cultural phenomenon that can't entirely be explained by the attributes of data centers themselves. Opposition is often amplified by anxieties about the big tech companies, the ways that technology has rapidly changed our society and economy, and concerns about what is coming next with all this new AI stuff. So when applied to specific data center proposals, risks are often overstated and potential benefits discounted. The goal of our report is to provide an objective, evidence-based assessment of all the various issues. So not all data centers are created equal. On the left here is a rendering of the Oracle hyperscale AI data center now being built in Saline Township. And this is the kind of thing that people are often picturing when they hear the words data center proposal. But I think it's important to recognize that not all data centers are these hyperscale AI factories. There are dozens of data centers in Michigan that have been operating for years. I'm showing just a few here. There's Cogent in downtown Detroit, ACDNet on Grand River Avenue in North Lansing. And this bottom one's actually kind of cool. There's a local wood products manufacturer in Alpena, the cabinet maker basically. They sensed a local need and business opportunity, also probably a tax benefit opportunity, but they spun off their IT department into a co-location data center that now serves other local businesses and public institutions. So now that data centers are a thing, in scare quotes, totally innocuous and beneficial projects like this are often met with the same backlash as hyperscale AI centers. For example, earlier this year, there was a proposal for a small-ish 24 megawatt co-location center in Lansing from a developer called Deep Green, which specializes in reusing waste heat for district heating systems. So this proposal was actually brought in concert with the Lansing Board of Water and Light, who plan to leverage the investment to upgrade the downtown steam heat network. The public response to this was overwhelmingly negative. I watched those meetings, and opposition was just as vehement as if the proposal were for a 1,000-acre hyperscale center planted downtown. And the developer withdrew, which I think may be a loss for Lansing. I personally think this may have been a beneficial development. And I could be wrong, but the main thing I want to point out is that while this report is almost entirely about these big hyperscale centers, these traditional smaller co-location centers still sometimes get proposed and probably shouldn't be lumped in with the hyperscale enterprise developments. More generally, a theme of this report is that individual data center proposals should be evaluated on the merits on a case-by-case basis. The surge of hyperscale proposals in Michigan is largely related to a sales and use tax exemption passed in 2024. So that 6% tax on billions of dollars of investment adds up. So most hyperscale centers are proposed in states that have provided such a sales and use tax exemption or don't have a sales and use tax at all. Much of Michigan and other states' objective in providing tax exemptions such as this is the idea that these investments will prompt future investments and some kind of long-term tech industry economic base, evidence suggests that doesn't typically happen. There is a lot of activity around the construction phase for a hyperscale center. This is definitely a boon for construction firms and subcontractors and laborers. Once construction is over, there aren't a whole lot of jobs. It's hard to estimate. Validated employment stats are hard to come by. My baseline assumption has been about 100 permanent on-site jobs for a hyperscale site. That's probably a little high and it varies. Additionally, they're not typically business attractors. Part of the argument from data center boosters is that hosting a hyperscale data center can benefit the local economy by attracting additional high-tech investments and nearby jobs. I don't see much justification for this. This isn't like a typical billion-dollar industrial site that, once it's operational, requires an extensive local supply chain or services. Hyperscale data centers are kind of unique. The best analogy that I've been able to come up with is that they're kind of like an oil field. They are a site of extraction producing a commodity, potentially for global export. In this case, that commodity is data, which can be exported at near light speed. Assuming sufficient bandwidth, data travels through fiber optic cable at about 125,000 miles per second. There can be regional bottlenecks in the internet, and so proximity isn't a zero factor, but there's very little reason for data centers or other businesses to locate in the same city or even the same state as a data center that they might be connected to. So when you get a data center, you're typically just getting a data center. And there can be exceptions, but this is not generally a dependable strategy on which to build an economic base. That said, they can help the fiscal situations of governments through tax revenue. In Michigan, the state budget isn't going to see much of a difference through current policies. We've kind of given up most of the ways that we would benefit from this at the state level. But data centers still pay property taxes, and even with the partial exemptions they've been receiving, that revenue could be a game changer for local governments. For example, Saline Township is going to be getting about 2/3 of their revenue from the Oracle data center, which is taking up about 1% of the land area. Additionally, it's also typical for local governments to negotiate community benefit agreements in addition to property taxes or payments in lieu of taxes that might have more beneficial payment schedules than a typical property tax approach. So the fiscal health of local governments can benefit substantially from hosting a data center. So I've watched a lot of public meetings and I've heard the same concern shared multiple times. It often goes something like, these things are going to use so much power or otherwise be prioritized such that power outages will increase. That's pretty unlikely. And this gets kind of complicated, but at a basic level, residents are not on the same grid as hyperscale data centers. Hyperscalers connect directly to those giant transmission lines. When your power goes out as a resident or a typical small business, it's almost always a distribution grid failure. Unless you were around for the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, that was a transmission grid failure. And what happened after that failure was a whole lot of regulation. So now the transmission grid is, for one thing, quite well protected from storm damage, but more importantly, it is managed at the regional level through regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. These are independent nonprofit organizations with regulatory authority that work with the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so NERC and FERC, as well as state public utility commissions and each individual utility, all trying to maintain reliability on the grid. So Michigan's RTO is MISO, except for this little corner of the state, and that is PJM. We're going to be talking a lot about PJM because there are multiple data center hubs in the PJM region, especially Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia has a higher concentration of data centers than anywhere on the planet. They call it Data Center Alley. So the way that reliability concerns are described in public meetings are usually based on confusion. Data centers are not going to use up all the power, but there is a case to be made that data centers could cause problems on the distribution grid because they have caused problems on the distribution grid that have required grid operators at the RTOs to take emergency action to prevent cascading failure. There are a lot of technical reasons for that, but basically these are big, weird loads that can impose big, weird operational issues if not managed carefully. There have been no failures yet, but in anticipation of more data centers coming online, NERC, remember our friend, the North American Reliability Corporation, they've issued a level 3 alert, which I guess is kind of a big deal, as well as guidelines for managing data center loads without risking reliability. Now, the cool thing is, if managed thoughtfully, some of those big weird features of data center load could actually improve transmission grid reliability at basically no cost. No cost to the utility. We're kind of offloading some costs on the data centers, but I think they can handle that. So we should acknowledge that reduced reliability on the grid is a risk, but I think the regulators are on top of this. There are various overlapping and evolving policies to maintain reliability. That said, one of those methods of ensuring reliability is through market mechanisms. So there's also a risk that data centers could make power more expensive. But that's not a certainty and maybe unlikely in Michigan. So this chart is showing the change in inflation-adjusted electricity costs versus the change in power demand for all 50 states from 2019 to 2025. Generally, increasing power demand tends to reduce rate increases. Notice I'm being careful with my phrasing. The price of electricity for about the last 20 years has roughly followed inflation, so rates are going up over time. But if a state has increasing demand, the rate increases are usually mitigated. And I know this isn't intuitive. Economics 101 says that if demand for a product increases, the price tends to increase as well. But utility economics works different. For electric power, and this also applies to water and natural gas, if a utility has a large customer consuming a lot of product and contributing a lot of revenue, it allows the utility to apply that revenue to fixed costs of production, which reduces the cost burden on other ratepayers. And in fact, data centers with their big weird loads could potentially reduce electricity rates more than a typical large load, for example, if they can be at all flexible, agreeing to reduce usage when the grid is near capacity. That said, there is a valid reason for the public concern that data centers could increase electricity prices because that has happened in the PJM region, specifically through PJM's capacity market auction, which procures peak power generation actually 3 years in advance. And that 3-year timeline was actually part of the issue. And there was a lot more going on there, but data centers are part of the challenge and have contributed to recent rate increases in PJM states. So we know that PJM rates are increasing somewhat due to data centers, but I want to place this in context. Here we're focusing on the state average residential rates over the last 10 years. The thick black line is the US average. And again, this is inflation adjusted, so nominal rates have been increasing this entire time, but those rates tend to track with inflation. So in real terms, 2025 dollars, the average US residential power rate has been between 16.2 and 17.2 cents per kilowatt for the past decade. For reference, a typical refrigerator uses about 4 kilowatts per day. So the average American spends about 70 cents per day keeping the fridge cold. It's probably not bad. I'm also showing 2 data center heavy states in the data center heavy PJM region, Virginia and Ohio. Both states, at least up until 2025, have lower rates than the national average and much lower than Michigan. And you can see some uptick in the past few years, especially in Ohio. These states and the PJM region in general, there's a bunch of things happening, but one of the things that's happening is they are running into capacity constraints, and part of that is data center load. So these trends may be beginning to change in 2026, but I'm not too worried about Michigan. Michigan and MISO in general doesn't really have capacity constraints yet. And so accommodating data centers should be easier, at least in the near term. Moreover, there is broad agreement that data centers should not impose costs on other ratepayers in any way. What happened in PJM was that these things moved faster than the speed of regulation. But in MISO and Michigan, we can learn from that and apply those lessons. So the Michigan Public Service Commission, MPSC, is currently reviewing the proposed agreement between DTE and Google to power the data center in Van Buren Township. This is happening through a contested rate case, so there's a public docket. I pulled this out of the public docket. MPSC staff has produced a cost of service study and concluded that between both the Oracle and Google data centers on DTE's grid, DTE customers will see benefits of at least $400 million over the next 20 years. And it's likely to be more. They were using some pretty conservative assumptions there. DTE's own calculus, they proposed that from the Google data center alone, other ratepayers would see $1.7 billion in benefits. That's probably a little bit too high. There was some assumptions there. All of this stuff is subject to a series of assumptions and also subject to change. We, I think, are likely to see the contract terms revised through this contested rate process. There are already thousands of pages in that docket, so I can't follow it all, but I'm pretty comfortable that the process is working. The outcome will not raise rates on other DTE customers and is likely to provide net benefits that will help reduce future rate increases. So we spent about 5 months on this report, and about half of that time was on this power issue. The main thing I have to report is that it's complicated. The electricity sector has this Byzantine overlapping regulatory and advisory structure with FERC, NERC, MPSC, MISO, plus MISO actually has its own independent market monitor. Also the utilities, they're regulated for a reason, but they have incentives to get this right as well. And in many cases, these contested rate processes, rate case interveners are able to give their input, and that can be helpful too. So there are definitely differences of opinions, but there are many, many knowledgeable professionals working to get this right. So we should admit that there is a risk here, but it is manageable. I think it's being managed, and I think that there is more upside opportunity than downside risk. So now let's talk about water consumption, which is slightly different than water use. Water consumption is water that is used and not returned back to the watershed. With data centers that would be lost mostly through evaporative cooling towers. I've seen some sources say that data centers can use up to 5 million gallons per day. Not all of that is lost. A lot of it is, so maybe 3 million gallons per day in evaporative cooling. If data centers are using non-evaporative closed loop cooling, they're consuming very little water. For example, the Saline data center anticipates drawing, when they're operational, about 20,000 gallons per day. Most of that is probably going to landscape irrigation, watering the trees that they're planting for screening. On the other hand, the Google data center will be using evaporative cooling, possibly consuming a few million gallons per day at the site. And there could also be a lot of water consumption associated with power generation, maybe more even than on site. And that gets complicated because data centers tend to be investing in renewable energy and battery storage, which provides power with very little water. But they're also drawing from the grid, so it might be more relevant to average it out. So again, this is complicated, but worst case scenario for water consumption, you could maybe approach 10 million gallons per day for a hyperscale center using evaporative cooling. And this could be problematic in a water-stressed region, but most of Michigan is not that. In 2024, Michigan lost, not just used, but consumed, lost out of the watershed, about 450 million gallons per day, which is actually down about 25% just from 2020. So it would take like 10 worst case scenario hyperscale centers just to bring us back up to 2020 consumption. And again, real world usage is likely to be much less. So on a statewide basis, I don't see much risk here. The caveat is that there are sensitive local watersheds that have been depleted or could be depleted with unsustainable withdrawals. But this is now regulated. EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, assesses new withdrawals of over 100,000 gallons per day. And if one were found to be problematic, it would not be permitted. So we have regulatory frameworks in place to protect our waters, and data centers are receiving extra scrutiny. So I don't see much risk with water consumption. Now, water that is used but not consumed must be discharged back to the watershed, which leads to pollution concerns. Depending on the cooling system, the cooling fluid could be classified as hazardous waste. For example, if it's a glycol system. In that case, it would be trucked off and treated and disposed of under hazardous waste regulations. However that happens, that would be an infrequent maintenance procedure, not a regular occurrence. If the chemicals in the cooling fluid are not classified as hazardous waste, it would likely be treated and discharged. This would probably happen at a municipal treatment plant. In other cases, it could be treated on site or maybe pre-treated on site and then sent to the treatment plant, depending on what's in the fluid and the treatment plant capabilities. But all of these processes are regulated. There are laws against polluting water. And as long as those laws are enforced, there isn't much unique risk here. In fact, for all of the public concern about water pollution from data centers, I couldn't find any verified instances of data centers contributing to water pollution. And I looked. The closest I came to finding an actual case of data center water pollution, I mentioned before that opposition to data centers has become something of a cultural phenomenon. People click on headlines that imply data centers are bad. So press outlets are inclined to provide headlines that imply that data centers are bad, which reinforces public perception. And by the way, if you've tuned into this webinar to hear critical things about data centers, just hang in there. I got you on the next slide. Just not water pollution. Though this headline is alarming. The precedent is Flint, how Oregon's data center boom is supercharging a water crisis. This article actually provides good, long-form, in-depth reporting once you read past the headline. So I've created this very technical diagram to describe the issue elaborated here. There is a concentration of agricultural facilities in Eastern Oregon, feedlots and food processors. These operations produce a lot of wastewater that is high in nutrients, including nitrogen. This region of Oregon has infrastructure in place for agricultural facilities to pump wastewater to a treatment plant, which then partially treats it and disposes of it through land application. When applied properly, this can be a sustainable and beneficial practice. Nitrogen is an essential crop fertilizer, but in this case, land application has been mismanaged for decades, and now the groundwater is polluted with nitrates, which in drinking water can have all sorts of adverse health effects. It really is a big deal. So this was already a thing when an Amazon data center showed up in the area. They began using groundwater for evaporative cooling. This resulted in a concentrated effluent, nitrate-laden wastewater, which was then pumped back to the same wastewater treatment plant, and the cycle continued. But the data center is not contributing nitrate pollution here, just kind of moving it around. And it's not clear to me that they're making the situation any worse. Arguably, they could even help in remediating the aquifer if land application is done sustainably. But this is the closest I could come to a verified case of data center water pollution. And I want to establish that I do have concerns about water resource management in Michigan. I've written about this from multiple angles in the past, including nitrate pollution. And I'm not worried about data centers. Laws and regulations are in place to prevent adverse impacts so long as regulatory agencies have sufficient resources to enforce those laws. In my opinion, the biggest risk of hyperscale data centers is noise pollution. Noise is regulated at the local level, and data centers are pretty unique in the type of noise that they emit. This gets complicated, but part of the issue is that typical noise studies use something called A-weighted decibels. And there are valid reasons for that, but it may not be appropriate in a data center context. So this chart is showing 3 ways that decibels can be measured. This green line is pure unweighted decibels. This red line is the A-weighted metric, which discounts noise levels at lower frequencies. And data centers produce a lot of noise down here in these lower frequencies. So in a typical noise study using A-weighted decibels, much of the noise emitted from data centers is discounted and reported at a lower level. There are reasons for this, and it is often appropriate. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be any filtering or weighting in noise studies, but it's becoming clear that traditional methods aren't working. There are more and more frequent complaints about data center noise from facilities that aren't technically violating any ordinance. And I don't think this is people just finding a reason to be upset. I think that many ordinances truly are not sufficiently protective. This isn't a reason to panic or prohibit development. It is possible to site and construct these things in a way to prevent adverse impacts. It may just take a bit of extra effort to make sure. When we published this report, the conclusion on the data center section was basically that governments should pay a lot of attention to this and work with an acoustic engineer to conduct a sound study with particular attention paid to the unique attributes of data center noise. Since publication of the report, I've come across a model ordinance published by a nonprofit out of Pennsylvania that I believe addresses my concerns. I'm not going to go through this. I'm just showing a few screenshots to demonstrate how complicated this is. There's 4 full pages of this, and there's a lot of sciencey technical stuff that I honestly don't understand. But I think this is about the level of complexity and detail necessary to prevent adverse impacts from data center noise. So this can be done, and guidance is now becoming available. Another thing I'm concerned about is this data heat island effect. So just a few months ago, there was a study submitted to a journal. It's still in preprint, but the researchers claim to have identified the locations of over 6,000 hyperscale data centers globally. They defined this as over 100 megawatts, I believe. They then looked at land temperature satellite data from NASA. Basically, NASA has satellites with infrared cameras that orbit around and record the land surface temperature. And this is all public data, which is really cool, actually. So for each of the data centers they identified, they evaluated land surface temperatures from 10 months before to 10 months after the date that they identified the data center as becoming operational. So this chart on the left is showing the average temperature increase over time, as well as the range. So see this little ramp from negative 10 months to 0 time? That appears to be the traditional heat island effect due to development, just replacing a greenfield with concrete and steel. Now, this big bump from 0 to 1 month is apparently what happens when they turn the servers on. So they saw increases on average of about 2 degrees centigrade. That's about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and potentially some outliers of up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Furthermore, they saw this heat island effect bleeding quite away from the data center. So this chart on the right is showing the heat island impact in terms of distance from the square surrounding the data center. So at 0 kilometers, it's the same data as the other chart. And then as we move to the right, we're getting further away in distance. But they recorded impacts, somewhat significant impacts, 3, 4, 5 miles away, even measurable impacts at 6 miles away. Some of you may be familiar with this study and might be thinking, wait, wasn't that debunked? So I don't think so. I've read the debunkings. I do have many questions and concerns about methodology and interpretation, and I wouldn't say that this research is fully bunked. I wouldn't interpret this literally, but I think there's enough here to warrant concern and future research, especially since more concern has since come out. A different researcher used a completely different method, still using land surface temperature data, but focusing on one single data center. After statistically controlling for a bunch of stuff, he concluded that the land surface temperature increase from waste heat alone was about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit. That's not much, but this was a pretty smallish 12 megawatt data center, not hyperscale. The Selene data center is over 100 times larger. And so I have no idea how this phenomenon might scale, and I don't fully understand the methodology. But again, this is potentially concerning. A third study didn't use satellite data. The researcher actually had grad students drive or walk around a few data centers in Arizona, recording air temperature with like a research grade thermometer. Actually, I'm assuming it was grad students. It probably was. So they measured the air temperature about 6 feet off the ground. They found that as a light breeze blew across a data center, on the downwind side, the air temperature would increase by about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit on average and up to 4 degrees. So these are the only 3 studies on this topic that I've come across. They're all very recent, and this is the extent of the relevant research as far as I know. I expect this will become an active area of research very soon if it hasn't already. At the moment, I can't say how big of a deal this is. It should be possible to model these heat plumes and thermal impacts, but I haven't been able to find a good example of that kind of thing. For now, I can only say it's something to consider. There's some potential here to suggest that a hyperscale data center could turn, say, a 90-degree day into a 95-degree day for the surrounding neighborhood, but maybe not. Conclusion for now, more research is needed. Another concern is air pollution. Many data center air pollution concerns are related to one of 2 data centers, both operated by XAI. For some reason, state regulators in both Tennessee and Mississippi allowed XAI to begin operations with non-permitted off-grid methane natural gas generators. I don't think this should have happened. These are data centers that give data centers a bad name. And I think there was potentially negligent state regulation here. I don't know exactly how they're getting away with this, but I do not expect this would happen in Michigan. Another air pollution concern is about the diesel backup generators that are often on site at data centers. So there was a study on this in Northern Virginia, Data Center Alley. There was sort of an alarming headline that accompanied the study: data center air pollution rivals power plant emissions. Thing is, neither data centers nor power plants contribute that much air pollution. They did assess real world pollution, and data centers in Northern Virginia are responsible for about 2% of NOx pollution, negligible otherwise. And also Northern Virginia has pretty good air quality overall. They also developed some scary looking pollution heat maps. These were based on a theoretical modeling scenario where basically all of the data centers use their diesel generators to the maximum permitted levels. This hasn't happened. This probably won't happen. These are emergency backups. Backup generators are usually run for about 1 hour per month, one at a time, for maintenance purposes. So there are air pollution concerns, but with a couple exceptions, real world impacts are usually minimal. And again, we have laws and regulations in place to manage this. Some final things that we discuss in the report. Light pollution. I think this is really underappreciated and underregulated, but it's also easily managed. Look up darksky.org policy templates. we can protect from the adverse impacts of light pollution. We should be doing this with data centers and other developments as well. Construction disruptions are tough. These are big disruptive projects. Consider that in development agreements, be as protective as possible of nearby residents during the construction phase. And restrictive requirements are usually included in development agreements, but this also requires active inspection and enforcement of those requirements. The construction crews on the ground typically don't have such restrictive requirements top of mind as they're going about their business. I used to be a construction inspector, so I can tell you that. Rural land use. Data centers aren't actually taking up enough land to measurably impact the agricultural industry, but we should acknowledge the potential for psychic damage on rural residents from seeing crop fields replaced with giant AI factories. There are emotional costs here that can't be measured. As far as a global resource footprint, we acknowledge this because it is an issue that comes up in public meetings, but generally we suggest focusing on what we can control within our own borders. This may be a national policy issue, a global policy issue. There's only so much we can control about the global resource footprint of the technology industry. And the same goes for the socioeconomic impacts of artificial intelligence. There are a lot of valid concerns there, none of which are impacted by data center development policy in the state of Michigan. To have useful policy discussions, we should restrict our scope to the scope of things that we can actually control. Okay, so let's bring this together. First, all data centers are not created equal. Proposals should be evaluated on the merits, case-by-case basis. Second, this is not an effective economic development strategy. Typically, when you get a data center, you're just getting a data center. They don't typically bring in new businesses or secondary economic activity. Caveat to that is that they can significantly increase the property tax base, and local governments can negotiate some generous community benefit agreements. Another caveat I want to mention is that while data centers don't bring in new businesses, those small co-location facilities are often cited in response to local demand. So if we disallow all data center development, including co-location facilities, that could throttle local economic growth. That dynamic is changing. Co-location facilities are becoming more rare as businesses are moving to the cloud, but it's something to be careful of. Next, data center power can be accommodated without negative consequences. It is possible if you do this poorly or too fast, it could impose reliability issues or increase rates. But the industry and regulators, I think, are about on top of this, and there's probably more upside opportunity than downside risk in Michigan. Next, data centers are not a notable threat to Michigan's water resources, either through consumptive use or pollution. The water risk is often greatly over-exaggerated. Michigan has laws in place to manage any risk. The laws just need to be enforced. There are a couple of real risks on local impacts, mainly noise pollution and the heat island effect. We also know the least about these risks, so local governments should be very focused and pay attention to these things when evaluating proposals during the proposal phase, and also account for post-construction monitoring. Finally, these development policy issues should be considered independently from the socioeconomic impacts of AI. And I'm not saying that the development and adoption of AI tools isn't important. I too have concerns and opinions. I think there are many issues related to AI and the influence of big tech corporations that warrant discussion. But putting guardrails or prohibitions on data center proposals in the state of Michigan is not addressing those issues and is complicating the more pertinent issues at hand. So you can find our full report on our website, crcmich.org. Also, if you have any questions that come up after the webinar, you don't get a chance to ask, feel free to email me. And again, if you appreciated this perspective, please consider a tax-deductible donation. This research was conducted without any specific sponsor or outside influence, which is really quite unique, and being donation funded allows us to provide that. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thanks, Eric. And we do have a few questions on hand. A reminder, we're taking the questions through the questions function in the software, a little question mark up in the top right corner of the software as you see it. At least that's what I'm seeing. They've changed the format here, so I'm still learning it. So first question, are there any other development projects in Michigan that are comparable to the tax revenue opportunity that data centers could bring?
I have not kept up with the detailed proposals in individual projects. And as far as I am aware, none of them have really gotten to the phase where it's pretty clear that they're going to happen yet. Once that happens, I may evaluate them. But generally, these things are a lot of investment. And so we've been granting partial property tax exemptions to the development so far. But even with those exemptions, it has been quite beneficial for local governments, and I don't see a reason that would not hold true in the future.
You made the comment during the presentation that the data center loads, electric loads, are weird. They're clearly big, but are the loads weird, air quotes, compared to a large manufacturing facility or other big user?
They are, and here's the main reason. So these things are using a lot of electricity to power these very expensive, very sensitive GPUs and servers and electrical equipment. So the way that they're often set up now is that when they sense voltage or frequency fluctuations on the transmission grid, they're very quick to cut off and stop drawing power from the grid. So actually, the reason that these things are causing problems for transmission grid operators is that sometimes they unexpectedly stop drawing power. They're not drawing too much, they're not drawing enough. And so the operators have to, the grid has to be pretty balanced. So the operators have to compensate that by very quickly turning off generation resources. So for NERC's recommendations, one thing, they're trying to require some more robust ride-through capability to be able to handle a little bit of dirty power from the grid without disconnecting immediately. And also just basically more real-time communication with the grid operators. Let them know how you're set up, what you're doing, what you're going to do, and coordinate going offline and coming back online. So yes, these are actually very different than even equivalent size industrial operations.
Is there any risk of data centers ignoring water rules and just consuming water anyways? What would be the penalties if they did?
I don't see how. We do have, so on an abstract level, I'm concerned with that. I'm always concerned about our environmental regulators having enough resources and political support to enforce the regulations in place. But since data centers are such a focus, I don't expect that they're going to slip through the cracks. I think that they will be regulated to the nth degree. That could change in the future. Hopefully I'm not wrong about that. If that happens, I will definitely be writing about it.
Let me try to read this as best I can. I understand that this is not a stressed region in terms of water. However, Michigan holds much of the world's fresh water. It feels irresponsible to basically say that's not our problem and therefore we have no concerns. Are hyperscale data centers sustainable overall?
So I value our water resources very much. Um, the even in one of these worst case scenarios, unless we're drawing from groundwater that has been depleted or a local aquifer that's under stress, we can actually take and consume quite a bit from Great Lakes and unstressed aquifers without making a measurable difference to the aquifer. And so it becomes an emotional thing for some people using water for industrial benefits. But we've always done this. At this point in history, I think we're doing it better than we've ever done before. And I think it can be done sustainably, not without limits. There could be instances, local instances, or if data centers really proliferate more than we expect them to, where it would be unsustainable. But I don't see a very likely future scenario where that's going to become a global or statewide problem.
Regarding the heat island studies that were mentioned, do the studies only look at data centers or do they look at other large energy users? Are the data centers truly a unique cause of heat islands? So for instance, could we look at an auto plant or something like that and draw similar conclusions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had that same question and I couldn't find any research to answer my own question. So the reason that data centers are different isn't necessarily because of the power usage. Well, they're bigger. They are industrial loads, a lot of industrial loads, and power plants put out a lot of waste heat. And so I went looking to see if anyone's ever studied before what waste heat from large thermoelectric power plants does to surrounding land temperature or air temperature. And there's some stuff that kind of gets to it, but not really this issue. It seems like no one's ever been that concerned about this before, probably because large thermoelectric power plants and giant industrial facilities haven't been located as close to residential and commercial areas that these data centers are now being located in.
All right. Another question. I've been told that this technology is developing so fast that by the time these hyperscale centers are built, they will be obsolete. What can communities do after going through all this development to protect the communities to benefit, not pay greatly for these data centers?
I think that's a risk. I don't know what's going to happen with the future of artificial intelligence. I think for at least the next several years, we are going to be increasing demand for AI compute. There are some wildcards. If, for example, somebody gets quantum compute working, or there's paradigm shifting advancements in artificial intelligence and we no longer need these LLMs, that demand for data center capacity could disintegrate. Most likely, I think that no matter what happens, even if the users or use of these sites changes, they will still be valuable. The digital economy is just expanding. It's difficult for me to imagine a scenario where a site with sufficient power, sufficient cooling water, high-speed fiber would not be put to some use. In the event that happens, there are things you can do to protect yourself, and this is happening. For example, the Oracle data center in Saline, which I'm actually pointing to, you can't tell where I am, but it's about 8 miles that way from me. They've incorporated in their development agreement that the township is going to hold a $10 million surety bond, which, if the site remains vacant for a few years, they can use to demolish and decommission the site and bring it back to a greenfield. And every 2 years, the township has an opportunity to request more money for that bond if they project that demolition and decommissioning will cost more than they have. This is also a risk for the power sector if utilities and transmission owners build more infrastructure to accommodate these big power users, and that power use never materializes. There is some risk that they might not get the payback on that, leaving other ratepayers holding the bag. But again, in that case, they are really being protective about that in power purchase agreements and rate cases.
If data centers that use a large amount of water each day are usually sent back as stream anyways, it would return to the natural water cycle. Is there any merit to the criticism that data centers receive for using this water, or is it more a lack of educating citizens about how the water is sent back into the atmosphere?
So again, there's two issues. One is with consumption. And so the water that is evaporated, from what I can tell, is pretty clean. I have heard tell about the water that's being evaporated being contaminated with some of the effluents from the cooling water. I can't verify that. I can't verify that it's not true, but I haven't seen that actually happen. With water pollution, it seems to be more about what we don't know. And truly, a lot of these cooling systems are proprietary technology. So the wastewater treatment plant that's receiving them definitely knows exactly what's in that water, as does Eagle. But because the public can't see what is in the water, that leads to a lot of concerns. I'm fairly comfortable allowing the regulators and public utilities to manage this in the way that we expect them to.
All right. While discussing regulations on data centers, a lot of opponents argue that the state does not have enough data center specific regulations. When looking at regulations on water and energy use, what else should folks consider as far as protections in place for Michigan residents?
Yeah, that's hard. I've been thinking about that. I've read the proposed bills that were introduced in the Senate. I don't have an opinion yet. What I would point out is that a lot of those provisions, that's actually local preemption. We're directing local governments how they should manage their development policies within their jurisdiction, which we do in some cases. I don't know if it's justified here. I think perhaps guidance would be a better idea, but I currently don't have any conclusions on that. I'm not certain that more protective, especially data center specific, laws that are data center specific without regard for what we're managing. If we have a law that manages how much water data centers in particular can use without addressing other industrial users, that seems to me to be maybe sliding into that arbitrary and capricious definition. I'd be very careful about that. But all I can say now is that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, we have two more questions that I think don't fit into the time we have available. So we'll handle those offline and get it back to you.
Yeah, and if there's anything else people think of, please do email me. I am quite responsive.
So as I said at the beginning, we have recorded this session. It takes a few minutes to download it all, process it, put it on our YouTube channel and then on our website. But that will be done before the close of business today. Um, Eric has offered a few times if you have any follow-up questions, get in touch with him directly. We are open to coming out and talking to groups about this, sharing our information. And if there are other aspects of the topic that we can dig into, we do what we call council briefs that are short form research that can follow up on issues like this. So would love to hear any thoughts you have. Would like to know how you thought the webinar went, what we can do better, any issue like that. So with that, thank you all for attending. Enjoy our beautiful day outside, and we hope to hear from you soon.